Relatively few of the 23 Canadian prime ministers so far, including the current incumbent, his oldest son, Justin Trudeau, arouse among those Canadians and then those observers of the Canadian politics who care about the country's federal political leaders, especially the prime ministers, have aroused so divided and maybe heated arguments for and against, and evaluations both positive and negative, as Pierre Trudeau, who served a total of about 15 years as prime minister between April 1968 and his last retirement from that office in June 1984. He passed away in September 2000, if I remember correctly, at the age of 80. During his prime ministership, Canada expanded its net of social programs. However, there was regional alienation, and he was unable to stop for good the Quebec separatism, although in the May 1980 referendum, almost 60% of Quebecers voted not to give their separatist Parti Québécois government a mandate to negotiate the terms of separation from the rest of Canada with the Canadian federal government. He was instrumental in getting 9 out of the 10 provincial prime ministers or premiers to agree on the terms of the draft Canadian Constitution, or so-called repatriated Constitution, to be sent to the British Cabinet and Parliament. And then, following the passage of that Canada Act by the British Parliament in the spring of 1982, Prime Minister Trudeau and the British Queen, and by extension through her office as the titular head of the British Commonwealth, the Queen of Canada, Elizabeth II, signed the Constitution Act in Ottawa in April 1982. Pierre Trudeau could easily have retired after that accomplishment. For some reason or reasons, he decided to remain prime minister for 2 more years, during which time the Liberal Party's fortunes waned, and then many people blamed him for the Liberal Party's heavy defeat in the ensuing September 1984 federal elections, although of course a part of the blame was apportioned to his successor John Turner, a fellow Liberal, much like many people blamed a later successor, Brian Mulroney, for the Progressive Conservative Party's near demise in the 1993 Canadian federal parliamentary elections. Pierre Trudeau tried to establish some kind of middle power role for Canada, somewhat critical of the United States, without, however, going so far as to engage in any kind of formal diplomatic protests, let alone the recalling of either the US ambassador from Ottawa or of the Canadian ambassador from Washington, D.C. But, for example, he joined the Cuban dictator Fidel Castro for a song during his visit to that country, Cuba, in 1976. And during his last winter as prime minister, 1983 to 1984, he even undertook the so-called peace initiative, although its ultimate goals were unclear. It did earn him 1 prize, but it was probably mostly a failure. He then announced, after a celebrated walk in the snowstorm at the end of February 1984, his decision to step down as the Prime Minister and as the Canadian Liberal Party's federal leader, and left office 4 months later at the end of June 1984. In retirement, he also remained controversial. He spoke out strongly against the Meech Lake Accord, whose purpose was to bring Quebec formally into the group of provinces that accepted the Canadian federal constitution, although of course, according to the constitutional scholars and most or many political science teachers, through the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Canadian Constitution is virtually in force also in Quebec. And he probably was also critical of the Charlottetown Accord, which followed him. Both of these constitutional accords failed. The Meech Lake Accord, because it did not get the approval of all of the 10 provincial legislatures. The Charlottetown Accord failed already because it was, I think, rejected by a majority of voters in 6 out of the 10 provinces in a non-binding national referendum or federal referendum in October 1992. Okay, let's look at the first Prime Minister Trudeau's life more closely. Joseph Philippe Pierre Yves Elliott Trudeau was his full name. He was usually known as Pierre Trudeau, sometimes as Pierre Elliott Trudeau. He was the third longest serving Prime Minister in Canadian history, behind only fellow Liberal Mackenzie King and Conservative John A. Macdonald. He was originally a lawyer and individual and activist in Quebec politics. He especially criticized the authoritarian provincial government of Maurice Duplessis of Union Nationale. In 1965, he accepted invitation by certain fellow Quebec Liberals to be a Liberal candidate in that year's federal parliamentary elections, and he was elected. He soon became the Justice Minister, and he liberalized the laws regarding homosexuality and divorce, claiming that the state has no room in the bedrooms of the nation, or no place in the bedrooms of the nation. In April 1968, he won some or several other fellow Liberals in the Liberal Leadership Convention and then became Prime Minister, promptly dissolving Parliament to gain a healthy parliamentary majority. During his first parliamentary term, a number of reforms were adopted, but his style also was considered confrontational and often arrogant and self-centered. And since the Canadian economy was also turning down, and a number of critical books and articles had been published about him, he narrowly remained Prime Minister in the 1972 federal elections, where the Liberals only won 2 more seats than the Progressive Conservatives under Robert Stanfield. He had attracted initially some positive interest in his private life by marrying a 22-year-old woman, Margaret Sinclair, privately in 1971. 3 sons were born from this marriage, but by 1977 it effectively broke down, with Margaret separating from Pierre and Pierre Trudeau becoming the country's most famous single parent. They eventually got divorced in 1984. Trudeau mockingly rejected the official opposition leader Robert Stanfield's calls for wage and price controls in order to drive down Canada's high rate of inflation during the 1974 federal parliamentary election campaign. However, by by the fall of 1975, he imposed them on Canadians. Finance Minister John Turner resigned in protest. By 1979, he had become notably unpopular, although the public still had doubts about his main challenger, the Progressive Conservatives leader Joe Clark. In the divisive and inconclusive May 1979 federal parliamentary elections, the Liberals still defeated the Progressive Conservatives in popular vote by about 40% to 36%. The Progressive Conservatives, however, managed to win many more seats in Western Ontario and in Western Canada and in Ontario, and received 136 seats to 114. In late November 1979, Trudeau announced his decision to retire as the leader of the Liberal Party, just weeks before Joe Clark's minority Progressive Conservative government was defeated on its first budget. Trudeau then rescinded his resignation announcement and promised to remain leader through one more election campaign. In February 1980, the Liberals were returned to power, winning 147 seats to the Progressive Conservatives 103 and the New Democrats 32. But by the time Trudeau resigned, it was doubtful if the Liberals could win the next federal parliamentary elections, and indeed they couldn't, despite a temporary recovery in popularity due to John Turner's leadership campaign. So, despite his personal motto, reason before passion, and his early Trudeau mania, especially young Canadians found him so popular in the late 1960s and the start of 1970s because of his youthful and athletic appearance, although he already had lost much of or most of his hair by the time he became Prime Minister. His personality and political career roused polarizing reactions throughout Canada. Admirers praise Trudeau's intellectual force and his political acumen, maintaining Canada's national unity, suppressing a Quebec terrorist crisis in October 1970, although at the cost of one life, that of Quebec Labour Minister Pierre Laporte, fostering a pan-Canadian identity and in achieving sweeping institutional reform, including the implementation of official bilingualism, official multiculturalism as well, patriation of the Constitution, and the establishment of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Critics accuse him of arrogance, economic mismanagement, and of unduly centralizing Canadian decision-making to the detriment of the culture of Quebec and the economy of the Western provinces. And of course, critics, internationally minded critics or continentally minded critics would accuse him of having had less than cordial relations with some US political leaders. His oldest son, Justin Trudeau, is now serving as the 23rd Canadian Prime Minister and is the first Prime Minister of Canada to be a descendant of a former Prime Minister. The elder Trudeau was born in October 1919 in Montreal, Quebec, and also died there in September 2000, aged 80. Out of wedlock, he fathered as an old man a daughter whom Deborah Coyne, a constitutional lawyer, bore at the start of the 1990s. According to a longtime friend and colleague Marc Lalonde, the clerically influenced dictatorships of António de Oliveira Salazar in Portugal, the Estado Novo, or New State, and Francisco Franco in Spain, El Estado Español, the Spanish state, and then Marshal Philippe Pétain in the Vichy France, called l'État français, or the French state, were seen as political role models by many youngsters educated at the elite Jesuit schools in Quebec. However, Trudeau opposed this, and according to Lalonde, his friend's intellectual development later on as an intellectual rebel, anti-establishment fighter on behalf of unions and promoter of religious freedoms came from his experiences after leaving Quebec to study in the United States, France, and Britain, and to travel to dozens of countries. He studied French progressive Catholic philosophers such as Jacques Maritain and Emmanuel Mounier, as well as two British or English philosophers, John Locke and David Hume. Locke famous as a pre-Enlightenment philosopher, Hume famous as an Enlightenment philosopher. Trudeau earned his law degree at the Université de Montréal in 1943 He was conscripted into the Canadian Army and decided to join the Canadian Officers Training Corps. However, he did not see military action during the Second World War. He said later that he was willing to fight during the Second World War, but to do so would have been to turn his back on the population of Quebec, whom he believed to have been betrayed by the government of Mackenzie King. In an Outremont by-election in 1942, he campaigned for the anti-conscription candidate Jean Drapeau, who later served as mayor of Montreal. He then completed a master's degree in political economy at Harvard University's Graduate School of Public Administration, now the John F. Kennedy School of Government. Then he studied in Paris, France in 1947 at the Institut d'études politiques de Paris. Finally, he enrolled for a doctorate at the London School of Economics in Britain. However, he did not finish his dissertation. He was interested in Marxist ideas in the 1940s. However, he decided not to become a Marxist. He had clear social democratic tendencies, shown in his later support for generous social programs. Several times before he decided to become a liberal, he had spoken from the platform of either New Democratic Party or its predecessor, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. Perhaps this is my idea, in protest at the strongly right-wing, even authoritarian policies of the Union Nationale government under Maurice Duplessis in Quebec. The Harvard dissertation remained unfinished when Trudeau entered a doctoral program to study under the socialist economist Harold Laski at the London School of Economics. This made stronger Trudeau's belief that Keynesian economics and social science were essential to the creation of the good life in democratic society. From the late 1940s through the mid-1960s, he was primarily based in Montreal and was seen by many as an intellectual and also as a critic of the Duplessis government. An associate professor of law at the Université de Montréal from 1961 to 1965, he eventually decided to run for the House of Commons as a liberal. Together with his friends Gérard Pelletier and Jean Marchand, these three wise men all were elected in that election. As Minister of Justice, he was responsible for introducing the landmark Criminal Law Amendment Act. For example, it decriminalized homosexual acts between consenting adults, legalized contraception, abortion, and lotteries, placed new restrictions on gun ownership, and authorized breathalyzer tests on suspected drunk drivers. And he famously declared, "There is no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation," adding that what's done in private between adults doesn't concern the criminal code. He also liberalized divorce laws. He won the liberal leadership with the support of 51% of the delegates on the fourth ballot. He defeated several prominent and long-serving liberals, including Paul Martin Sr., Robert Winters, and Paul Hellyer. One of the minor candidates was the Consumer and Corporate Affairs Minister and Trudeau's second brief successor, John Turner. During the 1968 federal election campaign, Trudeau famously promised to make Canada a just society. He defended strongly the newly implemented universal or national health insurance and regional development programs, as well as the recent reforms found in the Omnibus Crime Bill. He put into place during his first term many procedural reforms to make the Canadian Parliament and the Liberal caucus meetings run more efficiently, significantly expanded the size and role of the Prime Minister's office. His critics later would claim that he was, in fact, under his democratic facade, an authoritarian leader. and substantially expanded the welfare state, which of course required more spending and higher taxes. Official bilingualism and multiculturalism were instituted during his first term, while many Quebecers criticized the official multiculturalism, believing that it challenged Quebec's claim of Canada as a country of two nations, and many English Canadians criticized it as a cynical ploy to get immigrant voter support in elections. This idea is at least partly from an Estonian Canadian academic who lectured on the Canadian history or Canadian literature at the University of Helsinki in the late 1990s when I took such a course. And then many English Canadians, especially in the Western provinces, criticized, and also partly in Ontario, criticized the official bilingualism policy for being unnecessary and wasteful, and of unnecessarily favoring a fairly small French fluently bilingual elite at the expense of other people, and also pointing out the fact that many other languages, in addition to English and French, were spoken in Canada, and those languages had no official status. The first major policy failure of Prime Minister Trudeau's first term was the 1969 White Paper on Indians, promoted by Jean Chrétien, the later Prime Minister, who was the Minister of the new Department of Indian and Northern Affairs, as part of Trudeau's push for classical liberal participatory democracy. However, Trudeau was critical of referendums or direct votes on proposed laws by the eligible voters. That statement proposed the general assimilation of First Nations into the Canadian body politic by eliminating the Indian Act and Indian status, the parceling of reserved land to private owners, and the elimination of the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs. It prompted the first major national mobilization of Aboriginal activists against the federal government's proposal, and therefore Trudeau set aside the legislation. In the October crisis of 1970, certain pro-independence terrorists, who were also Marxists, the Front de Libération du Québec, Front of Liberation of Quebec, kidnapped the British trade consul James Cross, whom they later released, and the Quebec Labour Minister Pierre Laporte, whom they killed. Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act and then answered a CBC journalist's questions of how far he would go by saying, "Just watch me." This response was still controversial, although he defended it in a nationally televised speech. Such New Democrats in Parliament as Tommy Douglas and David Lewis opposed it. However, most members of the public, according to opinion polls, saw it as maybe a sad necessity. Among the international celebrities whom Trudeau received or met was the British-born rock star John Lennon and his Japanese-born wife Yoko Ono. Lennon said after talking with Trudeau for 50 minutes that Trudeau was a beautiful person, and that if all politicians were like Pierre Trudeau, there would be world peace. In his second term, from 1972 to 1974, he required the NDP support, and he made moves that pleased the political left, introduced some tax reductions, and created Petro Canada. During his third term, he implemented minor reforms, and then introduced in October 1975, over 1 year after mockingly rejecting them, the wage and price controls by passing the Anti-Inflation Act. He continued his attempts at increasing Canada's international profile, including joining the G7 group of major economic powers in 1976 at the request of US President Gerald Ford. In July 1976, the House of Commons narrowly voted to abolish the death penalty completely and instituting life sentence without parole for 25 years for first-degree murder in Canada. He faced increasing challenges in Quebec, however, culminating with the election of the first separatist government under René Lévesque and Parti Québécois in November 1976, and then the referendum that was held on sovereignty, on giving the Quebec government the mandate to negotiate the terms of separation with the Canadian federal government in May 1980. However, almost 60% voted against that measure. He temporarily lost power to Joe Clark in June 1979, but came back in March 1980. During his final term, he concentrated first on instituting the Canadian Repatriating Constitution. He tried to stimulate the economy with mixed success. The National Energy Program created a firestorm of protest in the western provinces and increased what many termed Western alienation. After retiring from politics, he joined the Montreal law firm Heenan Blakey as counsel and settled in the historic Maison Cormier in Montreal. He continued to speak against the Parti Québécois and the Quebec sovereignty movement. He also remained active in international affairs, visiting foreign leaders and participating in international associations such as the Club of Rome. In 1985, he met, for example, the new reform-minded Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. He published his memoirs in 1993. They became one of the most successful Canadian books ever published. During his last years, he was afflicted with Parkinson's disease and prostate cancer, although he continued to work at his law practice until the summer of 2000. He was devastated by the death of his youngest son, Michel Trudeau, who was killed in an avalanche in November 1998. He died on September the 20th, 2000, and was buried in the Trudeau family crypt, Saint-Rémy de Napierville Cemetery, Saint-Rémy, in Quebec. His son Justin, who is now the Canadian Prime Minister, delivered the eulogy during the state funeral, which led to widespread speculation in the media that a career in politics was in his future, and that was indeed the case. While Trudeau had liberal-minded attitudes towards human sexuality, for example, he, at least according to some of his friends, had a deep but private religious belief. He stated in an interview in the United Church Observer in 1971, "I believe in life after death, I believe in God, and I'm a Christian." Trudeau maintained, however, that he preferred to impose constraints on himself rather than have them imposed from the outside. So in this sense, he believed he was more like a Protestant than a Catholic. According to Michael W. Higgins, Trudeau's spirituality influenced in a major way his inner life and defined him, although he kept it mostly private. In March 1971, he married the 22-year-old Margaret Sinclair at St. Stephen's Roman Catholic Parish Church in North Vancouver. Trudeau was an intense intellectual with